going to talk about Andrew Jackson today, and a special shout out to Ms. Susan Poger, a retired teacher from Chappaqua, New York, who years and years ago put together this lovely PowerPoint that I've since modified, and we're going to go with that. So thanks again, Susan. Big fan over here in California. In any case, the big essential question we're going to come back to a few times throughout these few videos here is the extent to which Andrew Jackson is changing the executive branch, right? Andrew Jackson claims to be the champion of the common man, much like Thomas Jefferson. He claims that he's more of not a supporter, rather, but a representative of the typical yeoman farmer, right? But some argue that he actually took on almost a monarch like role in terms of shaping the executive branch. He uses the veto more than any other president before him. He ends up overruling ultimately a Supreme Court decision, and he will also essentially kill the Bank of the United States. So we'll talk about that throughout the course of these videos, but in a lot of ways, both of these ring true. So it's really up to you guys to make the argument which one is he, right? Or to what extent is Andrew Jackson the champion of the common man? All right, just to give us a little bit more of a global context, or at the very least, a context within the Americas, we're experiencing a series of Latin American revolutions in the 1820s. So this is during the Jacksonian era, right? This follows the War of 1812, and there are a series, as you can see on this map over here on the right, of former European colonial countries who seize their independence, draft new constitutions. Many of these constitutions are loosely based off of the U.S. Constitution. Some of the constitutions actually forbid slavery from the beginning, such as the Mexican Constitution, so that will become important even in U.S. history with regard to the future of slavery in the Civil War. Um, let's just zoom in on Mexico a little bit more really quickly. You can see on the map already it became independent in 1821. In 1824, Mexico adopted a constitution, and as I said earlier, like many Latin American countries, its constitution was modeled after the U.S.'s. And you're going to see that early independent Mexico struggled quite a bit between people who wanted a stronger central government and people who wanted more government within the states. The Mexican government is also divided into a series of smaller states. And also, the Mexican economy was very unstable at the beginning of its independence. And we'll talk about how that also plays into the U.S. relationship, because, in particular, the way in which that impacts the future of the state of Texas. Okay, so all that stuff is really important to keep in mind. The president of Mexico at this time, Santa Anna, has some dictatorial qualities. He does lose ultimately during his presidency the state of Texas to the U.S., but one could argue that he survives that at least to a certain extent. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's get back to just Latin America as a whole. We've talked about the Haitian Revolution in class, but I don't know if we've talked about it in the videos, so just very, very brief. As of 1804, Haiti was officially independent from France. Their revolution was longer, so it started, as we recall, in the 1790s, and led by Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, who ultimately takes on almost a Napoleonic military leadership in Haiti in order to seize its independence, right? The Haitian independence movement actually does some serious damage to the sugar trading industry in the Caribbean, and ultimately a number of revolts that result in Latin America, particularly in the sugar producing regions, also leads to the wide scale or abolition of slavery in these parts of the world as well, which is really significant. That's not to say that slavery is abolished in all parts of the Western world or all parts of the colonial world, but we will start to see some abolition movements early on, most notably in England, and that's going to also play a role in shaping the American future of slavery. In any case, also in 1837, you can't see Canada much on this map, but there was also a revolt in Canada. There was a union of the upper and lower Canadian states as a result of this Canadian revolt. And the French-speaking population, which was in Quebec province, even though this is British, right? Remember that this used to be a French colony, so many people in this part of Canada still prefer to speak French, right? They're largely still bilingual in this part of Canada, but at the very least, when Upper and Lower Canada unite in 1837, the Quebecois people, the French-speaking people, feel sort of alienated from the rest of Canada in many ways, and there's a long-standing continuity there as well. In any case, another major development, and actually I want to go ahead to a different slide. Whoop. To show about that is we're seeing an impressive expansion of the voting population throughout this time period, right? In the early 19th century, so during the days of the Washington and Adams presidencies, for example, it was still largely white property holding men that could vote, rather, right? And as you can see, as we move forward, especially once we get into the 1840s, we have virtually universal white male suffrage, right? So, in other words, most white men above the age of 21 were now able to vote, right? But of course, that's not universal manhood suffrage because it's only the white population. But nonetheless, this is one of the major reasons why candidates like Jackson are able to be elected so handily, is because so many more people are voting, and many of the people that are voting were less affluent than the previous voting population, right? So this is seen in some eyes historically as a very significant accomplishment of democracy, right? So in any case, in 1824, let's talk about the first time Andrew Jackson runs for president. Remember that Andrew Jackson was already seen as a war hero from the Battle of New Orleans and eventually also the Seminole War, which takes place after the War of 1812 is over, right? Where he's essentially trying to get rid of the Seminole, the Native American population in northern Florida, because they were staging in raids over the Georgia border. And if you remember from the last videos, Florida was acquired, annexed into the United States in 1819 as a result of a treaty with Spain. So in any case, here's Jackson, right? He runs on the ticket nickname Old Hickory. Let my cursor go away again so you can see that. Old Hickory, right? Sort of the idea, hickory tree, right? Incredibly strong, right? Deep roots, and also this idea that he is experienced, right? That sense Old Hickory. There's more to it than that, but, sort of a catchy nickname to hopefully appeal towards his voters, right? But Andrew Jackson did not win the election of 1824. He actually was challenged by four other men, right? And this is sort of problematic in a lot of ways because you're going to see that with that many people running in a presidential election, it's going to be difficult for anyone to get the majority of either popular or electoral votes, which was indeed the case in 1824. But nonetheless, here you see Andrew Jackson's challengers. The ultimate winner will be John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. He's John Adams' firstborn son, right? Henry Clay, we've talked about him quite a bit, but Henry Clay, congressman from Kentucky. We have John C. Calhoun from South Carolina and William Crawford from Georgia. Um, and as a result, let me just break down what happens in the election of 1824. So, as you can see down here, not one of the candidates actually wins a majority of the Electoral College. And according to the Constitution, you can't just win the most electoral votes. That's called the plurality, right? You have to have more than 50% in order to actually win the presidential election, right? So, in any case, none of these candidates actually get that close, right? Andrew Jackson actually, as you can see here, wins more electoral votes than John Quincy Adams. But nonetheless, since there was no majority, the election did go to the House of Representatives. And there was a negotiation that took place in order to choose the next president. And especially Jackson and all of his supporters nicknamed this negotiation the corrupt bargain. And the reason why that was because the Speaker of the House at the time was Henry Clay, right? One of the runners, or candidates for president, that is. But Henry Clay did not get very close to winning, right? So he knew he wasn't going to win. But still, as the Speaker of the House, he had significant leverage in choosing who the next president was going to be, right? John Quincy Adams was friendly with Henry Clay, a lot of political connections, right, in Congress. So ultimately, John Quincy Adams, at least allegedly, promised Henry Clay a position in his cabinet as Secretary of State. Now, traditionally, at this point, all of the former secretaries of state became president eventually, right? So, for example, Thomas Jefferson and the Secretary of State under uh, George Washington, rather, ends up becoming president eventually, and every other Secretary of State up until that point, right? So, nonetheless, this ends up happening. Now, we all know the sort of irony here is that Henry Clay never does become president, but nonetheless, because Andrew Jackson felt robbed in this election, he felt that it was political cronyism at its worst. The election was nicknamed the corrupt bargain. Andrew Jackson, at that point, is feeling robbed, right? And the next 4 years, Andrew Jackson never really stops campaigning, and this time he campaigns on the premise that he should have won the 1824 election. And in the meantime, as we already discussed, the voting population was expanding. And so Andrew Jackson can sort of use that premise that he lost the election because it was stolen from him to attract more votes, right? Here's another graphic that shows us some of the voting requirements around the turn of the 19th century and then again 30 years afterwards. So you can really see it here, I think. So notice how many of these states require property ownership in order to vote, right? Western states were a little bit more progressive, partially because their populations were smaller, right? So they need more people ultimately to vote. So you see states like Kentucky and Vermont, for example, actually being open to universal white male suffrage already in 1800. But nonetheless, by the time you get to 1830, and Andrew Jackson, by the way, was elected in 1828, you see how many of these states have now either opened up the vote for all white males above the age of 21 or white males who meet certain tax paying qualifications, right? So this is really significant. Okay, so once John Quincy Adams is elected, much like his father, he was not necessarily the most popular, especially among the Jacksonians. Right? Jacksonians, by the way, are quickly going to emerge as an opposition party to the Democratic Republican Party, so to the party of John Quincy Adams. They're called Jacksonian Democrats most of the time, right? So let's just, for the simplicity of this slide, talk about the opposition to John Quincy Adams as coming from the Jacksonian Democrats, right? So the Jacksonian Democrats first thought, just like John Adams Sr., that John Quincy Adams was too elite, right? Harvard educated from Massachusetts, right? Much more tied to a more open trading policy, more opposed largely to things like protective tariffs, right? And the supporters of Andrew Jackson were more in favor of things like westward expansion. And of course, people that supported John Quincy Adams didn't like that, right? They don't want to expand west because that's going to continue to decrease the power of the coastal states, right? In general, they did not like the idea of a stronger centralized government. Those are, again, the opponents to John Quincy Adams. And just like his father, again, just like former Federalist, John Quincy Adams does believe that a lot of things should be nationalized. And he even believes in expanding some of the arguably, again, some of the policies that his father started, right? Most notably, he wants to nationalize certain forms of education. Remember that his father created the American Navy, right? You see that John Quincy Adams wanted to also nationalize a naval academy to continue to strengthen the U.S. Navy. At this point, the U.S. Navy had already experienced a significant challenge during the War of 1812. They came out of it intact, but John Quincy Adams didn't want to take any chances, right? So he wants to also expand the naval power of the U.S. Nonetheless, a lot of people were really nervous of this sort of envisioning of the presidency. Many people thought that John Quincy Adams might become too controlling of the executive branch, which is sort of ironic if you take the position that Andrew Jackson arguably did just that as well, right? But nonetheless, let's talk about some of the protective tariffs that are passed under John Quincy Adams's presidency. realized that in general it was the people like John Quincy Adams or the people like John Adams, right, the former Federalist, now largely the Democratic Republicans, who actually believe that there should be protective tariffs passed to basically help American manufacturing businesses expand without foreign competition, right? So you don't have to worry about all these tariffs specifically. Arguably, the most significant one, well, you have the Tariff of 1816, which sort of is one of the first major protective tariffs that you see. And these other tariffs are essentially expansions of this first tariff. The Tariff of 1828 is nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations because by the time this tariff is implicated, there's going to be a major opposition, specifically from the South and to a certain extent the West. So there are going to be some Jacksonians that actually do support the tariff, but they're largely located in more eastern areas, right, and also sometimes northwestern areas, areas that benefit from trade. But the South, which was much more of an isolated rural economy, right, that depends largely on cotton, did not like the idea of a protective tariff because they wanted to be able to trade really openly with the rest of the world. They did not want any sort of hindering taxes to be placed that would get in the way of the cotton trade, right? So, nonetheless, the Southerners and some Westerners were really opposed to this 1828 tariff, and they call it the Tariff of Abominations because they saw it as abominable to pay, right? And so, this is going to be seen as a major opposition to John Quincy Adams' administration. And this map just shows you who voted in favor of the Tariff of Abominations and who opposed it. So, kind of interestingly, you do see that there were some areas that were on the coast that opposed it, but other areas like the New York City, the Manhattan area specifically, not the Hudson River, but at the mouth of the Hudson River, rather, the Philadelphia area, they all support it. But then you're seeing, particularly in the South and West, a lot of opposition to the tariff. And these are going to be areas where Andrew Jackson ends up picking up a lot of votes in 1828, right? Let's actually cut it off with the election of 1828. It's good to take a break, and we'll get back with the part two. Thanks.